John chapter 18, verse 12. While you're turning there, last time we talked about Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane there. Jesus has not suffered physically yet. So in order to be tempted in all ways as we are, and yet without sin, he has to endure that also. So that's not part of the payment for sin. It's just part of all the ways he needs to be tempted to show an example for us. And so that's what that was about. There are multiple temptations involved with suffering, pain, including trying to hurt others physically, trying to hurt them mentally or verbally, something like that. And even though that group has come to take him and hurt him, he does none of those things in return to them. And so, but Jesus had made it a habit to go to that same place each night. It's a familiar garden that they go to there on the Mount of Olives. They've stayed there multiple times, especially this last week. It's every evening there that they're going back to this same place. They're establishing that habit so Judas Iscariot knows where to find them when he brings those to arrest him. That's by God's plan there. He wants it to be predictable, so they'll find him, and when they come, he actually moves toward them. You remember Jesus asked, "Who are you searching for?" And they tell him Jesus of Nazareth, and he says, "I am." And they fall backward there to the ground there, proving that they aren't taking his life in those things, proving that to his disciples, that he's laying down his life. They can't take him unless he allows them to. And so Judas, you remember, goes ahead and gives the sign to identify Jesus by kissing him there, and Jesus publicly identifies him then as the betrayer. Judas, I believe, wants to come back like he's just joining right back in the group and he's not all a part of the arrest party, anything like that, but Jesus isn't going to allow that. And he confirms there with the crowd that he is the only one they're supposed to be there arresting, that they're not there to get the disciples, and so the disciples are free to leave there and protecting them in that way. But you remember Peter draws the sword and swings it, which then makes him susceptible to arrest and a trial because he cut the high priest's ear off, tried to kill him there, and Jesus undoes that and, of course, attaches the ear back on there. This week, we're going to continue with the next question that Jesus asked. This is the first of the trials that he will face. There's 6 of them in total. We'll talk about that a little more as we go on. But John 18, 12 through 27, I'll read this and then we'll go through it. He says, "Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him and led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door without. Then went out that other disciple, which was known unto the high priest, and spake unto her that kept the door, and brought in Peter. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art thou not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. And the servants and the officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest. And Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto him, Art not thou also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, Did not I see thee in the garden with him? Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. Now, in these verses here, we know there's 2 events going on at the same time. Jesus' trial is going on and Peter's denial is going on. Those are going on simultaneously there. And you see as you read throughout the text there that John kind of bounces back and forth between those two. Just to give you both pictures at the same time. It's interesting, during those trials, Jesus there comes as the lamb before his shears is dumb, just as Isaiah prophesied there. Isaiah 53:7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before his shears is dumb, so openeth not his mouth. Jesus is only answering when compelled to answer. He's basically just accepting what's coming there. He's not very verbal at all about that. While that's going on, Peter, you remember, is the most vocal of any of the disciples of Jesus. He is always spewing something out. It's just like he has to say something, right or wrong. He's just got to say something there. And he just always putting his foot in his mouth and speaking up sometimes when he should be quiet. And this is one of those opportunities there where maybe he could have been more vocal, and yet he's trying to remain silent. And it's really odd there. When Jesus is compelled to speak, he spews out righteousness. When Peter is compelled to speak during this time, his is sinful. It's lies. It's something to protect himself there. And so, but Peter's denial isn't just a verbal denial. It's also in his actions there. But Jesus' picture is not just a sacrifice there where he's going to be crucified, shed his blood for him, but it's also, he's offering grace and long suffering there to Peter and the other disciples as well too. But you see this group that they brought here. This is still in the middle of the night, still dark. Actually illegal to have a trial before daylight, but we'll talk about that here in just a minute. But there's this whole different, just a whole conglomeration of different kinds of people at the trial there. There are Annas is first there. That's Caiaphas' father-in-law. He's the first one we see there who's conducting the first trial there. And of course there are Jews there. There are also Gentiles in this group there, including the Roman soldiers that are involved there. Some of these are slaves. Some of them are free people. There are priests there. There are Pharisees there, and people from all different walks of life. And even though these people wouldn't normally come together as one, it's kind of like the Pharisees and the Herodians and those different groups that came together just because they were against Jesus there. And that's what's happened here. This whole group has the same goal because they're blinded to the truth. And so many of these people, though, are religious people in this group. Now, the Roman soldiers probably not necessarily, but many of these in this group are religious people. Some would even claim to be God-fearing people. But they're all unsaved people. They're denying Jesus as Christ. And so I was reading an interesting thing on the internet, I believe it was today, the difference between Judaism and Christianity, right? Which is pretty simple. Right? In Judaism, the Jews disregard Jesus as the Messiah. They don't recognize him as the Messiah. Therefore, they won't recognize the New Testament either because it portrays Jesus as the Messiah. And so they're stuck in that false religion now because their Messiah has come and they've rejected him. But these people have... it's kind of like the church at Colossae we've been studying about on Sunday evening. A lot of these religious people, they've let traditions of men creep into their religion. They've let the rudiments of the world creep into their religion, and now it's false religion. And you see, even among these groups here, nobody ever denies Jesus' miracles. Right? Sometimes they claimed he did them by Satan's power, but they couldn't deny them. They couldn't deny the miracles that he had done. And so you even see a relative of Malchus's there listed in verse 26. And, it's not like they think Malchus faked the whole cutting the ear thing off. Like, when Peter swung the sword, he just screamed out and squirted some ketchup or something that looked like blood. Nobody thinks that was a fake. They all saw that happen. They all saw Jesus put the ear back on. They're not denying that. But yet they don't recognize him as God in human flesh. They don't recognize him as the Messiah. there. And so, those people that were there couldn't deny that they all fell backward at the same time when Jesus spoke to them. Nobody could deny that when they came to arrest him, but they're not going to recognize him as the Savior of the world. They're just refusing that. In John 18:12, he says, "Then the band and the captain and officers of the Jews took Jesus and bound him." That always tickles me. It kind of reminds me back when Samson used to torment the people and say, "Well, if you tie me up with this, then I'll be weak and I'll be just like anybody else." And they say, "The Philistines are upon you," and just snap. Jesus can just snap and just out of that at any time he wants to. It's kind of what it reminds me of. And so you think about this story and you think, well, why did he bother tying him up? Right? The disciples have already fulfilled the prophecy from Zechariah 13:7, which said they would flee. Right? And they've already fulfilled that, so they're not there. But in Matthew 26, Jesus said the same thing, that they would fulfill that in Matthew 26:31. But in Matthew 26:48, you see this? This is from Judas here. Judas Iscariot's given them this information in Matthew 26:48. He says, "Now he that betrayed him gave them a sign, saying, Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he, hold him fast." Judas says, "I'm going to identify him with a kiss." That's a kiss on a cheek, common greeting of a friend at that time. And he says, when I identify him, he says, hold him fast, which is really kind of a vain notion there. It's kind of like the kiss. The kiss isn't really necessary, is it? He said he would do it, right? But when they come to arrest him, Jesus says, "Who are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." And he says, "I am. I'm him. That's me." Right? And they fall backward, and he asks again, "Who are you looking for?" "Jesus of Nazareth." And Judas goes ahead and kisses him. Right? Well, he's just said who he is. He's already identified himself. Why does he need to kiss him? Well, maybe if he didn't do what he was told, he wouldn't get his 30 pieces of silver. I don't know how that played out, but it's really unnecessary at that time. But, Jesus has already proven to them that they can't touch him unless he allows that. He spoke and they fell backward. They couldn't even get close to him when that happened. Right? He did similar thing in Nazareth. You remember he preaches to his own people in his hometown of Nazareth and identifies himself as the Savior, and they go out to shove him off the cliff. Remember? And going to push him off the brow of the hill and kill him. And he just walks right through the middle of him. They can't touch him unless he allows them to touch him. And so he's proven that multiple times, but Jesus has proven that he can do miracles just by speaking. He doesn't have to touch. Some people he did touch, right? Others he just spoke to and they were healed. Others he spoke and he wasn't even close to them. They weren't even present there with him and he healed them. So he can do all those things by speaking there. And so, it may make them feel better if they, tie him up, but it's really not going to be effective if he chooses to be loose. But he isn't resisting this arrest. Over in Genesis 22, we get a wonderful picture of that when God tells Abraham to offer Isaac. And this is almost identical to what happens here with Jesus and these people as what happened with Abraham and Isaac. And in Genesis 22, verse 6 through 9, see this, and it says, "And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac his son, and he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and they went both of them together. And Isaac spake unto Abraham his father, and said, My father. And he said, Here am I, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together, and they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood." Isaac isn't a small child there. He's likely a teenager there, a young man. He's the one who carried the wood for the burnt offering. Isaac, you see there in that chapter 22, verse 6, and he says, "And took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it upon Isaac." Isaac is a strapping young man. He's the one going to pack the firewood. Abraham's going to carry the fire and the knife. That's all he's packing. He's an elderly, very old person at that time. So how is this very old man going to bind this teenage boy? Only if Isaac allows him to do that. Only if he allows him. Same way Jesus did, where he allows these people to bind him, take him to the trial there. And so that's the same picture that we get from John 18. Back in John 18, verse 13, it says, "And led him away to Annas first, for he was father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year." That's the first of the trials. 3 of those will be religious trials, and 3 of them will be civil trials. The religious trials will be with the Jewish people, and the civil trials, of course, will be with the Romans. The 3 religious trials, first is with Annas, then with Caiaphas, and Caiaphas then the Sanhedrin there at daybreak. But the 3 Roman trials are Pilate, then Herod, then back to Pilate again. We'll get to that later as we go through this. But the first trial is before Annas. That's Caiaphas' father-in-law. But he's addressed, you look down in John 18:19, and you see how Annas is addressed. It says, "The high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine." There, Annas is called the high priest. But we see back in the earlier verses, who is the high priest? Caiaphas. Caiaphas is the high priest. Now, how can Annas be the high priest and Caiaphas be the high priest? How many high priests do they have at one time? Supposed to be one. But, according to Jewish law, how long is the high priest supposed to be the high priest? Look back in Numbers 35, verse 25, or I'll read it to you. Caiaphas is identified as the high priest, but Annas is also called the high priest. Under the Old Testament law, the high priest is supposed to serve until his death. You see several references to that here in Numbers 35. It's talking about, in this instance, talking about if a person accidentally kills somebody else. Right? A relative or somebody may try to avenge that blood. And so if it was an accidental death, they could have cities set up around their territories there called cities of refuge. And you go to a city of refuge and you plead your case. And you say, well, I was splitting wood and the axe head flew off. I didn't chop that guy in the head and kill him. It just flew off the end of the handle and killed him. And so they go to that saying, plead their case. And if they determine that it's an accidental death, then that person stays in the city of refuge. He's protected there. And the other family members can't come in and issue death for death, exact justice. And they're protected, but they had to stay there. There in Numbers 35:25, "And the congregation shall deliver the slayer out of the hand of the revenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to the city of his refuge, whither he was fled, and he shall abide in it until the death of the high priest, which was anointed with the holy oil." And so when a high priest dies, they appoint another high priest. They anoint them, and then it goes on. We see that over and over in Scripture. But even though Annas is still alive, and he should be the high priest, the Romans didn't want one person to remain in the high priest office for very long, because the longer they're in there, the more influence they have with the Jewish people, the more power that they have, and then that's a threat to the Roman government there. And so they don't do that. They don't want to leave them in that position very long. The exception to that rule is Caiaphas. Caiaphas held that position longer than anyone else in the whole era of the Romans there, because he's their puppet. He's really playing along to what the Romans want to do, and so they let him stay in a lot longer than anybody else. Everybody else, they let him stay in a little while, and they do something that offends them, and they just yank them out. Some of them stayed in there a few days, some of them short periods of time, but nobody as long as Caiaphas. So even though Annas should still be the high priest, the Romans recognize Caiaphas. And the people have this growing resentment of what's going on in the temple system. And we talked about that during this same week. Jesus drove those who were selling the sacrifices in the temple courtyard there, the money changers, drove them out, and they were preying off of the people there, and the Jewish people really resented that because those leaders in those positions are getting richer and richer all the time off those little ventures. Every time they have somebody in there, they're making money off of it. Somebody that sells those sacrifices, they're getting a cut. Somebody that's exchanging the money for profit, they're getting a cut off that. Remember, those are the people in charge of the temple system. They're the ones that also inspect the animals for the sacrifices. If you bring an animal that isn't perfect, it's blemished or maimed or there's something wrong with it, it won't be accepted as a sacrifice. And so, it's really a corrupt system when you're the one doing the inspecting and you're the one selling the sacrifices if it doesn't pass inspection. And so you can imagine what happened. They find some kind of flaw or blemish or something. Sometimes maybe create a flaw or a blemish in those and say, no, that is not going to pass. You're going to have to buy one of these. Right? And then they have a huge markup on those animals that they sold, and they profit from it. Same thing with the money changers. People came from all different areas there. When you come to pay the temple tax, which isn't a lot, but it has to be given in Jewish coins. It has to be given in their currency. So if you come from somewhere else and you've got different currency, you have to exchange it for currency. And they charged a huge fee for that also, and they were profiting from it. And same kind of thing happened in the Old Testament where the sacrificial system became corrupt. You remember the priests were supposed to get a certain portion of that offering, and it was to be sawed, boiled, right? And then they drop in a hook and they get their portion, and the priest's son says, no, we don't want our meat boiled. We'd rather have ours grilled. Just go ahead and give us our cut off the front. And the people hated that. They resented it. And the same thing's happening at this time. And so, when Jesus comes along, He's dealing with the people honestly. He's being just with him. Everything he does is fair. And that's a refreshing change to what they're seeing in the temple system there. And so you see there in verse 14 of John 18, he says, Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. You see that back in John 11, verse 47. He makes this prophecy and is totally... This is not even a Christian, but God uses him to give this prophecy there. He has no idea what he's even talking about. In verse 47 and 48 of John 11, Then gathered the chief priests and the Pharisees a council and said, What do we? For this man doeth many miracles. And if we let him alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away both our place and nation. As Jesus gains more and more favor with the people, they're more and more repulsed by the crookedness that's showing up in the temple system. And they realize it, and they say, well, they're all going to leave us and go follow him. And so, he sincerely cares about them, and he's not doing that for financial gain. He's not cheating them or anything like that, like the Pharisees and the priests and the different ones are. And they say, if we don't do something, we're going to lose our jobs. We're going to lose our money train. We're not going to be able to profit from this anymore if he takes over there. John 11, 50 through 52, he says, Nor consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation should perish, that the whole nation perish not. And this spake he not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation. And not for that nation only, but that also he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad. And so Caiaphas prophesies Jesus' death, not only for the Jewish nation there, but for the children of God that are scattered abroad, meaning all nations. It's not just salvation for the Jews, it's salvation for the Gentiles and everybody else too. There in verse 53 of John 11, he says, Then from that day forth they took counsel together for to put him to death. So they've been planning this death for a long time. Remember, they don't want to have it at the feast day. The Passover feast is a huge crowd of people in Jerusalem. They do not want to have it at this time. But they can't pass up this opportunity either. they've got a chance to catch him away from the crowds. He's made himself very predictable by going to the Mount of Olives every evening. Judas has said he's going there every evening. This is a good chance to get him, and he's betrayed him. It's all worked out. They're going to take advantage of that. And so they've waited for a long time to try to get rid of Jesus. And back in John 18, verse 15, he says, "And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. That disciple was known unto the high priest, and went in with Jesus into the palace of the high priest." Now, from Mark's account, you can look over there, I'll just read it to you, but Mark 14:54, it says, "And Peter followed him afar off, even into the palace of the high priest, and he sat with the servants and warmed himself at the fire." When Peter's following him, he's following him afar off. He's not getting too close to the action there when he shows up there in John. And so, that happens sometimes with Christians, even today. You get in a time of temptation when you need to be drawing closer to God because the situation's going to be harder and harder to deal with in the right way, but instead we tend to back off a little bit. Well, I don't want to get too close there because something bad might happen to me in that scenario. That's where Peter is. He says, he cares about Jesus. He cares about what happens to him. He's come back after running away there at the garden, and he's come back and he's followed this hundreds of people there with their torches and lanterns and stuff, taking Jesus here to Annas first, and he's come back close enough to see what's going on, just really not close enough to be involved yet. And so, he could have been the other witness. There's another disciple there. Peter said before this in John 13:37, Peter said unto him, "Lord, why cannot I follow thee now? I will lay down my life for thy sake." He wanted to be close to him then. And he says, I'll even die if that's necessary. But now, he's too afraid to even get close. But the other disciple there, while Peter's cowering in the shadow, this other disciple there, not so far away, he's known by the high priest, so he goes right into the palace there. We know that's John. John never identifies himself by name in his own gospel. When you see the name John in the Gospel of John, it's John the Baptist. It's not John the Apostle. He never calls himself by name. In John 23 is one example of that. Peter therefore went forth, and that other disciple, and came to the sepulchre. That was Peter and John. They ran to the sepulchre there. John outruns him, but we know that story there. But John never refers to himself by name. It's something obscure like that. Sometimes he uses the title, the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's how he identifies himself, but he never calls himself John. But John, his mother is Salome, which is related to Mary. Right? Mary is related to Elizabeth. They're cousins. Right? Elizabeth's husband is Zacharias. Right? Zacharias is John the Baptist's dad, and he was the one there in the temple offering the incense when he gets the message that John, they're going to have a baby, his name's going to be John, all of those things there. Of course, he's associated with the priesthood, and those priests would know the high priest. So John has this kind of family connection through the priesthood, through Zacharias, to the high priest. And so the high priest knows him there. And so he goes right on in. Right? And John knows Peter's on the outside. And so as he talks to the damsel that kept the door. There's a slave girl there. That's what that word damsel means. And tells her to let Peter in. So Peter comes in there. And then Peter starts getting recognized. That's when the temptations begin there. Right? He needs to be getting closer to Jesus. John is in there when the trial's going on. If Peter goes in there, by Jewish law, they needed how many witnesses to prove something true or untrue? 2. Right? You had to have 2 witnesses. Right? Also, by Jewish law, right, they couldn't incriminate themselves, but he could be the witness. But he doesn't want to get involved. He doesn't want to be identified as a disciple. I know a man who was friends with a preacher. This preacher used to go out of town on motorcycle rides. And he'd say, "Don't tell people I'm a preacher." because he wanted to do things while he's on them motorcycle rides that preachers shouldn't do and Christians shouldn't do. And he didn't want to have to explain himself to those people in that group. And he says, no, don't tell nobody that. And he was the only one in the group that knew. And so, same kind of thing there. He's not only denying Jesus with his words, but by his actions, by trying to stay away there. And even before Peter starts talking here, he's denying it with his actions, right? He's trying to keep his distance. He's trying to remain anonymous. He's trying to blend in with the accusers of Christ. There in verse 17 of John 18, he says, Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. I am not. This is a slave girl. A slave girl. She thinks she recognizes Peter as a disciple. She asks him about it, and he says, I'm not. That's the first denial. We know that. First verbal denial. He wasn't afraid of hundreds of armed men who were coming to arrest Jesus when he pulls the sword and starts swinging it, but he's afraid of a little slave girl. What's he afraid of? What's he thinking? She could tell on me. What does that matter? You remember when they came to arrest Jesus? He says, who are you searching for? Right? Whom seek you? Right? What did they say? Jesus of Nazareth. Right? He confirmed that again. Right? Who are you seeking? Jesus of Nazareth. Only one person. Right? What does it matter if they know it's Peter or not? What do they matter? John's not afraid to go in. John goes into the trial. They don't arrest him. They don't kill him. Right? They don't do anything. They've only got paperwork to arrest one person. That's Jesus of Nazareth. But Peter's afraid the slave girl's going to tell on him, right? And get him in trouble, and he doesn't have any accusations against him. Look at John 18:18. He does make his way inside. He says, And the servants and the officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Now this is in the spring, and we understand how spring weather works. The days can be pretty comfortable, but the nights get pretty cold too. And so when you're standing out there at nighttime, this is early in the morning, still dark, it's going to be cool out there. It's cold, so they make a fire. They're standing around warming themselves, and Peter slips right in with them. Oh, I don't want to be cold either. I don't want to suffer. He's trying to blend in with the world. He's blending with the enemies of Christ. Paul wrote that in Romans 12:2. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Peter didn't grasp that yet. He does write this over in 1 Peter 1:14. He does get it eventually, but he writes this later on. 1 Peter 1:14 and 15 says, as obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lust in your ignorance, but as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation. He learned that for himself later. Don't fashion yourself like the world. Don't try to blend in with the world. Be holy. Be separate from the world. Don't be conformed to them. Right? Man, he knew he was supposed to stand out from the world. He was just choosing not to, because that'll endure some suffering. I'll have to be in the cold. If I snuggle up with the world, I can be warm at this moment in time. He writes again in 1 Peter 4:1 and 2. He says, For as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind. For he that has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh to the lust of men, but to the will of God. If he had suffered at that time, he could have avoided the sin that he was involved in there. But when Peter wrote that letter there, it was settled. He was going to live the rest of his time not in his own lust, but in the will of God. He's going to follow that then, but at the trial, that's not the case. So you look back at John 18:19. John bounces back to what's going on with Jesus at the trial. In John 18:19, the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. So this is Annas here, who asked Jesus about his disciples and about what he's been teaching. It isn't an underground church. They've not been hiding. They've been going from the temple to the synagogues, from city to city. They went through Galilee, they went through Samaria, they went through Judea, Perea, Decapolis, all of those different places, and they're teaching the same kinds of things everywhere. It's not something they're doing in secret. They did it on the roads, they did it in the gates of the cities, everywhere. Very rarely do we see Jesus have a private time of instruction with his disciples. Very rarely does that happen. When he does that, he turns around and teaches the same things in public again. We talked about how it's kind of like a review for the disciples. They're kind of getting, they're just kind of ordinary, simple people, and they're getting to rehash those teachings, but he's not giving anything in secret there. And so, they've come to these public settings. They've heard him teach these same things over and over again. And so Jesus asked this question there in verse 20 and 21 of John 18. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. Now, why does Jesus say that? Why does he ask them that question? Well, this isn't a legal proceeding. It's not a legal trial. Right? In a legal proceeding, first of all, it has to be in daytime. Right? It has to be in daytime. You can't have a trial at night. It has to be a public hearing. Secondly, we talked about there a minute ago, a person couldn't incriminate themselves. They couldn't be forced to witness against themselves in a legal proceeding. We have an amendment to our Constitution called the Fifth Amendment. You can't be forced to incriminate yourself in a trial. You can't do that. But who's the only one here? Who's the only one at the trial besides the Jews? It's Jesus. There's nobody else. Right? John's not called to be a witness at the trial. Right? He could be, but he's not. Right? And so, the idea was, if you only have one person at a trial, they could probably beat that person up or, torture him or some way and get him to confess to something. And they say, well, he confessed to it, so that, we're going to go ahead and punish him or kill him or whatever the consequences was. And especially if they did that in the darkness. But no, they weren't allowed to do that. And so when Jesus says, why askest thou me? Right? He says, ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. He's saying, call the witnesses. Right? If this is supposed to be a legal proceeding, a legal trial, go ahead and call witnesses. Have them testify. Do it during the daytime. Make it a legal trial there. Don't pervert judgment is what he's saying there. He's actually calling them on their sin there. People don't like to be called on their sins. They don't like to be. John the Baptist is an example of that. You remember he talked about Herod Antipas's relationship with his brother's wife and stealing her away, and he ends up in prison for that. Eventually gets his head chopped off. People don't like that. In John 18:22, see this, and when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? The officer knows that Jesus has just accused the high priest of some kind of wrongdoing, not having a legitimate trial and not having the appropriate witnesses, and so he strikes him with the palm of his hand, slaps him real good for that there. And Jesus isn't being uncooperative. He isn't being insolent or any kind of rebellious or anything like that. He's just exposing that this isn't a legal trial, and they know that. But either way, if you insult the person presiding over a legal proceeding, there are usually consequences for that. In our court system, they have that fun little thing called contempt of court, right, which can be a big deal. It can be a big deal, and so that's what's going on here. But once again, Jesus has resisted the temptation to hurt others. He's just been smacked in the face by this officer. Right? He doesn't do anything. Right? Doesn't do anything. Back in Matthew chapter 5, he's actually living out something that he has taught his disciples previously to this. He's done nothing wrong. He's just got slapped in the face for telling the truth, for exposing someone's sin. In Matthew 5:38 and 39, Jesus taught this there on the Sermon on the Mount. He says, you have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And he's just lived that, right? He's just lived that. He's just given them that example there that he taught. Peter gets to see that. John gets to see that. Others there at the trial, right? Peter writes about that later in 1 Peter 2:23. He says, who when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. Jesus doesn't revile them, which means to criticize in an abusive way. That's what that means, in an angrily insulting manner. No, he doesn't threaten them. He just asks that question there. John 18:23. He says, Jesus answered him, if I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? He's exposing their wrongful treatment of him, but he still hasn't said anything that isn't true. He still hasn't done it in an insulting or abusive manner. He hasn't done any of those things there. And so, even though Jesus is the one on trial, it's obvious who the judge is. Right? He's going to be the judge of the whole world. Right? It's obvious that he is the judge in the picture there. They don't even know how to conduct a legitimate trial there, to make it legal there. And so, they've made accusations of no crime. They haven't brought any witnesses to testify yet. Right? So what happens? If you don't have any accusation of a crime and you don't have any witnesses to testify, what's supposed to happen in a court proceeding? Dismissed. Dismissed. Happens all the time. We have those, what they call preliminary hearings and grand jury hearings and those kind of things. And you bring those people in, somebody that they maybe has had an accusation or something against them, and they determine if there's enough evidence to even have a trial. If there's not enough evidence to even have a trial, there's no witnesses, there's no evidence, they just dismiss it. There's no use in wasting the court system time to let that go to trial. So, but they're not going to let Jesus go. Even though they haven't made any accusations yet, don't have any witnesses yet. They're going to find those things. Right? Look at John 18:24. He says, now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas, the high priest. So they're going to start conjuring up some false witnesses, try to get those things in line. They're going to try to make some accusations about Jesus trying to be king, even though when they tried to force him to be king, what did he do? He refused that. Refused that. Wasn't time for the kingdom yet. His own people wouldn't accept him. The kingdom's not coming yet. And of course, they're going to get him accused of blasphemy. Well, yes. If you're not God, it is blasphemy to claim to be God. That is a crime punishable by death under Jewish law. If you're not God. If you are God, it's not blasphemy. So, but they won't recognize him as God, so that's the charges they're going to eventually come up with. And so John moves back to Peter again, though. John 18:25. And Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said therefore unto him, art not thou also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. Now, Peter's already denied with his actions and once with his words, and he's trying to blend in with the world. This is another slave girl that asked this question there, thinks she recognizes Jesus, and when they ask him if he's one of the disciples, says he denied it and said, I'm not. Same response. No, that's not me. That's twice. That's twice. Second time he's denied verbally. There in verse 26, he says, one of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, did not I see thee in the garden with him? Right? Now you got to remember the guy who was swinging the sword at your relative, right? Chopped his ear off. Jesus, that guy probably you'd recognize in a crowd, right? That was kind of a big deal, right? So this is a relative of Malchus's. He was there at the garden when they arrested Jesus. He saw the whole thing. In Luke 22, verse 59, you see there's a little bit of time going in between this. It's about an hour later from the last scene, Luke 22:59. He says, and about the space of 1 hour after, another confidently affirmed, saying, of a truth, this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean. Right now, they know he is a Galilean. How do they know he's a Galilean? Well, how do we recognize people from the south? How do we recognize people from the north? They don't talk like us. Right? They don't talk like us. I get tickled sometimes, these telemarketers and stuff. If it's not one of them foreigners, I get tickled just to see if I can figure out where they're from. Because a lot of them you can tell, okay, you got to be Alabama, Georgia, somewhere in that area. And if it's a little less sharp, then you say, well, it's maybe the Carolinas or something. And so I hardly ever get any northerners, so I like to hear northerners talk too. But that's how you recognize them. You recognize them by that accent. So they can probably recognize a Galilean from the accent there. But notice Matthew 26 and verse 73. Matthew 26 and verse 73. He talks different, but this is really good. Matthew 26:73. And after a while came unto him they that stood by and said to Peter, Surely thou art one of them, for thy speech bewrayeth thee. Now there are lots of people who have come to Jerusalem from Galilee for the feast of the Passover. How is he identified not just as a Galilean, but as one of Jesus' disciples? Well, this man talks not only the way a Galilean talks, he talks the way a Christian talks. And he talks the way a Christian talks. He says, his speech bewrayeth thee. Bewrayeth is the word delos, which means evident, certain, obvious. The disciples obviously talk differently even than other Galileans. It's evident that he's one of them. That's a wonderful testimony for a Christian to be identified by just the way you talk. Right? Christians not only don't curse and carry on and have filthy and lewd comments, those kind of things, but we also are supposed to be talking about God. That's what sets us apart. You can have any kind of moral, decent person that doesn't curse and swear and be filthy and those kind of things. You can have that. That doesn't necessarily make them a Christian. Right? But Christians talk about God. Right? And it's evident here that Peter talks like a Christian talks. Right? And that's a wonderful testimony until Matthew 26:74. Until he thinks he's being identified as not only a Galilean, but a disciple in Matthew 26:74. Instead of using that for a witnessing tool, Peter goes another way. He says, Then began he to curse and to swear, saying, I know not the man. And immediately the cock crew. He starts talking like the world. Right? Cursing, swearing. Right? That's worldly talk. Right? So they won't think he belongs to Jesus. Right? Of course, that's the third denial there, and then the rooster crows again. Back in Luke's account there, hold your place here in Matthew because we're coming right back here, but Luke 22:60, see what happens right after this. In Luke 22:60 through 62, and Peter said, Man, I know not what thou sayest. And immediately while he yet spake, the cock crew. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter. And Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said unto him, Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. Bitterly. Peter's trying to keep his distance from Jesus. He wants to know what's going on, but he doesn't want to be close enough to suffer along with Jesus. He doesn't even want to be far enough away that he's going to have to suffer in the cold. He's going to get close to the fire with those in the world. And then he's gone through all that process there. He's denied him. He's even cursed there to make sure they don't think that he's one of Jesus' disciples. And then immediately the rooster crows and Jesus turns around and looks at him. Turns around and looks at him. I remember, I probably told this before, but when my mom and dad and them we got to be teenagers a little bit, and they'd let us sit away from them sometimes at church. and we'd be preaching, and if we'd be carrying on with our friends or something like that, I'd hear that, right? And I'd he'd turn around, and there he'd be looking at you. And it's the walk of shame. You got to get up and go back and sit with them. I mean, we didn't have no, and it wasn't like, shh, you need to be quiet, you need to know. And that's the way Peter is. When it happens, Jesus turns and looks at him, and he remembers it. Right then, he goes out. This big burly fisherman goes out, cries like a baby. Right? He's broken about it. Right? Peter's sorry for his sin. He's broken. He's humbled there. He has regrets. His regrets turn into repentance. Right? He does change. We see that in his letter, how he changes. He doesn't want to be conformed to the world, doesn't want to act like the world, doesn't want to be close to the world. He wants to be close to Christ. He wants to do that. Judas Iscariot has a similar reaction. Look at Matthew 27 before we close. Matthew 27, 3 through 5. He has regrets too. He has regrets over what he's done after it's happened. He just has a different reaction. He didn't want to be identified as the betrayer of Jesus. Jesus exposed him as that anyway. Right? He did want to profit from it. We see that. After it happens, though, he changes his mind. And he says, no, I'm just going to give the money back. I'm going to undo it that way. It's not about a repentance of the heart. He's just sorry he's got caught up in it. He's sorry that the disciples know that he was the one that betrayed him. He's sorry all those things come upon him. And he has regrets like Peter, but his reaction's different. Look at Matthew 27, 3 through 5. Then Judas, which had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself. Well, that sounds good right there, doesn't it? Oh, he's going to repent. Right? He's going to change. Right? No, he says he repented himself and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned and that I have betrayed the innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? See thou to that. And he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. Right? He hanged himself. There's the regrets there. Right? The desire for repentance is there. Right? But, he doesn't change his heart. He just changes his life, ends his life. I don't want to live like that anymore, and he ends his life. Everybody goes through trials, not physical trials necessarily, like a public trial or a civil trial, anything like that. We go through trials, times of temptation, those kind of things, and those same opportunities come along where you can either be bold for Christ. Right? You can expose sin for sin, right? Call it for what it is, not just play along with it, act like it's okay, those kind of things. Right? We can have that kind of boldness, and we may suffer for that. We're gonna have some consequences for that. Peter did that later in life, right? Not at this time because he betrayed Jesus or denied Jesus there, and he really didn't have to suffer much during that time until Jesus looked at him. Right? But we're going to have those chances there. But the question is, are we going to do what God calls us to do, or are we going to deny somehow? Sometimes it's not necessarily our words, but our actions, right? How we deal with things, and sometimes it's both. But. Okay. Any questions? Any comments?